So I will now like to introduce our final speaker of the day, Berengere Dubrulle. She's a senior scientist of the CNRS. She at CEA Saclay. She is the director of the Les Ouches School of Physics, which, as we know, runs incredibly influential summer schools in physics. Her own specialty is the study of turbulence, and in particular, its application to astrophysics and geophysics, although she's, I think, more widely known in the astrophysical community. But in any case, she is a fitting successor to George Batchelor and Alan Townsend as a lecturer to trace the developments of George's work in the modern understanding of turbulent flows. And her lecture, as shown in her slide, will be on the nature of turbulent motions at on small scales. Berengere, à vous.
Thank you, Tim. Hello, everybody. So first of all, I would like to thank the organizer for these wonderful meetings and for the invitation. And of course, like all of you, I would have preferred to deliver my lecture in Cambridge, and I hope it will soon be possible to travel again, and especially to do science the old way, you know, with talks around the blackboard, and in Cambridge, probably a cup of tea. Well, as a start, I have to confess that I never actually met George in person, but like everybody, I encountered frequently his work and results during my career. So for this meeting, I thought it would be nice to celebrate George's achievement by revisiting some of his work in the light of some recent developments. And so, as you may notice, the title of this talk is actually borrowed from a joint paper of George Batchelor with Alan Townsend in 1949. And on this talk, I will also speak about some rather obscure or less known results discussed by George in section 4.6 of his book, An Introduction to Fluid Dynamics. And about this result, these last results, actually, George was saying, he was speaking about a fluid flow with velocities that varies like inversely like the distance to the axis of symmetry. And he says that this kind of procedure is indirect in that we do not know what kind of flow field we have or whether it is physically significant until the mathematical solution has been interpreted. But it can be quite purposeful in experience. And in the end of this talk, you will see that actually I will use this kind of velocity field to try to discuss the structure of possible structure of small-scale turbulence. Regarding the paper of George Batchelor with Alan Townsend, we must realize that at the time where there was a paper, the way to measure, it was very challenging to measure velocity in flows. And also the means to analyze signals were very limited. And so in their paper that I will discuss briefly, George and Alan use hot wire to produce velocity measurement and oscilloscope to analyze this signal. But nowadays, we have now much better ways and much precise way, maybe not precise, but much better way to measure velocities in fluids. And in this talk, I will speak about results that were obtained using PIV, particle image velocity velocimetry, that consists, that can be done by seeding the experiment with small glass particles, typically a few microns, a few tens of microns, and then shining them with a laser and recording periodically their position with very fast cameras. And then by involve data processing, then we can reconstruct actually the Lagrangian trajectory of all the particles within a small volume. So here, what I will discuss are measurements taken in a 2 centimeter by 2 centimeter by 0.5 centimeter volume. Here you see about 40,000 trajectories that are recording using a time resolution that is less than the Kolmogorov time. And actually, these measurements are also reserved at the Kolmogorov scale, because the Kolmogorov scale here is about 0.3 millimeter. What I want to say also is that the experiment was done in a von Karman setup, by which the velocity is the flow is produced by the counter rotation of two impellers that you see here at the top and at the bottom. And all these measurements were quite difficult, so it took a huge team, we call it the exploit team, to produce all these measurements and to analyze them. And analysis is still on the way. So here are the list of all the co-authors on this experimental measurement. Well, with respect to George Stein, now we have also an advantage is that we have the possibility to perform numerical simulation of Navier-Stokes equation. And so we can get access to all variables in the flow. And in this talk, I will discuss also some results that were obtained first using classical numerical simulation of a homogeneous isotropic turbulence computed using spectral methods. But on the right, you see also a numerical simulation by one of my PhD students, Hugues Faller. It is actually a numerical simulation of our experiment, the von Karman flow. And this was made possible by using very involved numerical methods and, for example, using penalization method to compute the turning of the impellers. And also here you see a list of all papers that contributed to this numerical analysis. Okay, so just before starting, here is the outline of my talk. So starting from Kolmogorov theory, we will follow the path opened by George Batchelor, and so to discover possible pitfalls of Kolmogorov 41, to see how they are linked to intermittency and vortex reconnection. And all this will finally lead us to a modern description of small-scale structure in a world which is possibly haunted by some strange entities that we will call pinsons, and which were first invented by Landau and then were described by Batchelor in his book. Okay, so let us start by the beginning of our path, by Kolmogorov theory. As you know, as was very well depicted by Uriel Frisch in his book in 1990, Kolmogorov theory, in fact, can be thought as a theory based on symmetries of Navier-Stokes. Indeed, if you start from Navier-Stokes equation and you use invariance of Navier-Stokes by space translation, so you use homogeneity, then you are able to derive this very famous equation, the so-called Karman-Howard-Monin equation, which I have recalled here. This equation is just an energy balance at a scale L. It involves quantities named delta U, which are the velocity increment at a scale L. And it just depicts how the time variation of the energy at scale L is influenced by the energy input, epsilon, the energy transfer at the scale L, and the energy dissipation by viscosity. So this is a famous equation. And if you further assume, as Kolmogorov did, stationarity that comes from invariance by times translation, by the way, and the existence of an inertial range where dissipative processes can be neglected, then you arrive to the famous Kolmogorov fourth-third law, excuse me, by which the third order moment of the velocity increment scales proportionate to L. So now you can use another symmetry, very interesting symmetry of Navier-Stokes, which is valid only if nu is equal to 0, but since we are in the inertial range, we think we can use it, by which if you rescale the space, time, and velocity using this transformation for any gamma and h, then the equation of Navier-Stokes are invariant. So if you apply this to this equation, you say that the moment should be self-similar, and then by self-similarity, the second order moment should scale like the third order moment to the power 2/3, and then you arrive to the result that the second order moment is proportional to epsilon L to the power 2/3, and then by mere Fourier transform, then you reach the famous Kolmogorov spectrum, by which E of k is equal to k minus 5/4. Okay, of course, Batchelor knew about this theory. Apparently, I learned from the booklet that Keith sent us very gently, that he learned by it through papers that reach England through ballast for some warship or something like this. Anyway, he was able to read the paper. And in this paper with Townsend, in fact, they were very impressed by the result by Kolmogorov, and they were investigating what are the limitations of K41 theory, and what is the behavior of small scale in a Kolmogorov picture in some sense, and more precisely, how is the spectrum of energies, okay, minus 5/3 terminating. And in the way to treat this question, they performed a hot wire measurement of velocity, and they computed a high order velocity derivative using Taylor hypothesis. And they measure more precisely the flatness, a generalized flatness of this velocity derivative. That is, they took the average between the force moment of the nth velocity derivative divided by the second power of the second moment of the velocity derivative. So here you have an example of the results they obtained. Different lines here represent different Reynolds number. And here on the axis, you see measurement for different order of the velocity derivative. And what strikes you at first sight is that this flattening factor, in some sense, they increase with Reynolds number at any order. And the higher the order, the higher the increase is with Reynolds number. So from this observation, Batchelor and Townsend drew the remarkable conclusion that they say, since high order of the velocity derivatives are associated with very large wave numbers, or in other words, very small scale, then these results suggest that there is present an effect which becomes increasingly important as the wave number is increased, or as we go toward smaller and smaller scale. So to find this effect in this time was not so easy. And what they did is very clever thing, is that they looked at their signal, the signal coming from the hot wire, using an oscilloscope to try to filter out the signal and to see what was going on when you increase the order of the derivative. And here is the result. And you see that from this oscillogram, these are the conclusions that they drew. They say that oscillogram of the velocity derivative show that the energy associated with large wave number is very unevenly distributed in space. There appears to be isolated regions in which the large wave number are activated, separated by regions of comparative quiescence. This spatial inhomogeneity becomes more marked with increase in the order of the velocity derivative. It does with increase in the wave number. It is suggested that the spatial homogeneity is produced early in the history of the turbulence by an intrinsic instability in the way that a vortex sheet quickly rolls up into a number of strong discrete vortices. Thereafter, the inhomogeneity is maintained by the action of the energy transfer. So here you see, just from this very porous, very scarce measurement, they are able to put away 4 important and really visionary concepts, because this is exactly what now we describe as intermittency. That is, large velocity gradient comes from unevenly distributed in space regions, and they come from an instability which makes the small scale of turbulence look like strong discrete vortices. Okay, so there are no way to check this at this time, but now we have measurement, and just before I show you measurement to see how this vision is actually true, I just want to make another interpretation of their result. Is that if you say loosely that derivatives, velocity derivatives are just the limit as L tends to 0 of the velocity increment divided by L, then for example, the flatness at the order 1 is just the limit as L tends to 0 of the structure function of velocity increment of order 4 divided by the second order structure function at the power 2. And so if velocity structure functions are self-similar, as Kolmogorov say, then this flattening factor should be constant. And instead they grow with Reynolds number. So by this thing, we also see that there is a potential problem with Kolmogorov. And in fact, the modern view of this potential problem is about deviation from self-similarity of turbulence. And it is computed now by looking at the whole scaling law of the velocity structure function. So in the Kolmogorov theory, if everything is self-similar, this velocity structure function should go like L to the P over 3. And here I show you a measurement of this velocity structure function in our experiment. So I want to stress that it's not so easy to get this kind of measurement in experiment because you need to have access to all the scales. Here we don't invoke any Taylor hypothesis. So it was done very cleverly by one of our postdocs. He was also using zoom at different scales and putting together all the results. Well, it's a huge work, but anyway, what you see is that indeed the velocity structure function of different orders, here p equal 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to 9, they actually scale they are actually power laws. But if we measure the exponent from this power law, these are the red dots here. You see in our experiment, like in any numerical simulation, any other kind of experiment, you see clearly that there are deviations from the n over 3 law, from the p over 3 law. So this is a problem with K41, and we have to understand where does the problem come. And of course, Batchelor and Townsend showed us the way. They say, okay, if there is a problem, it's something that is happening at small scale. And according to them, it was a problem of intermittency and vorticity being distributed into tubes. So what we can do is, for example, to use numerical simulation of our experiment, but this is done with any numerical simulation, and look at regions that are characterized by places where vorticity is higher than the strain, in some sense, so using the Q criterion here. And what you see is here, it's a jungle of spaghettis. If you compute the dimension of these entities, you have here a distribution of dimension, and you see that they have dimension between 2 and 2.5. So it's a mixture of vortices, of spaghettis and sort of sheets. It's intermediate between the two. And of course, these things are not staying like this forever. They have some sort of dynamics. And these dynamics now can be observed by experiment. And here I give you the example of a beautiful experiment that has been done by Mike Keown et al. Recently. And in fact, these vortices they interact, and the interaction is quite complex. It involves creation of second-filamentary filament, tertiary filaments, etc. So it's a kind of cascade of interaction with production of smaller and smaller filaments. You can also study the interaction of vorticity structure by DNS. It's much easier in some sense because experiments are very challenging. And this was done recently by Yao and Hussain. And again, you see that during the interaction of two vorticity filaments of opposite vorticity, then there is a creation of a cusp by which they reconnect. And then again, creation of a kind of bridge, vortex ring, and then again, a lot of small structures that are appearing slowly during the process after the reconnection. So this is quite interesting because they were using DNS, so they were able to measure locally at each given time the energy spectrum. And what they observe is that here you see the time of reconnection is 1.51. After reconnection, you see that there is slowly the building of Kolmogorov spectrum, K-5. So it means that by this, we have under our eyes the way how the Kolmogorov cascade is proceeding. So this is very nice, and this is very nice for Kolmogorov. This explains Kolmogorov by reconnection of this structure. But there is a sign that something is strange. If you recall the symmetry of Navier-Stokes, you say that this processor, if it's a kind of self-similar processes, then there should be some kind of scaling laws describing these processes. And for example, if you study how the distance between the two vortices evolve with time, if the process is self-similar, it should go like t minus t01 over 1 minus h, when h is a scaling exponent. So if we are Kolmogorov, we would expect h equal 1/3, like the one that appears on the Kolmogorov spectrum. But if you look at the results they obtain an exponent 0.75 before reconnection, which is suggestive of h equal minus 1/3, and an exponent 2 after reconnection, which is suggestive of an exponent 1/2. So with these processes which build the cascade, we see that there is appearance of several scaling exponents. Well, this is something very interesting. And in fact, this is something that is the basis of the multifractal model of Parisi-Frisch. They observe that due to the scaling symmetry of Navier-Stokes equation that I showed you from the very beginning, it seems that there could be more than one single exponent in turbulence. There could be arbitrary h. And so what they did is that they postulated that a turbulent flow is a kind of region like this, in which you have small region, for example, a region in red, where the local exponent is equal to 0.32, and then in between you have a smaller region when the exponent is slightly smaller, etc. You have some sort of a Russian doll perspective, and you can introduce the probability of hitting a set where the scaling exponent is equal to h, and you do it by saying that the probability to hit a set where this exponent is equal to h at a scale L goes like L to the c of h, where c is a function, and c is a kind of a codimension of the set of places where all scaling exponents are equal to h. So all the properties of turbulence are then encoded in this function c of h, because then you can show that the scaling exponents are just given by a Legendre transform property that I recall here, the minimum over h of nh plus c of h. And we have, like many other measures, this function c of h in our experiment, and it has this shape here. The green dot are the point, but like everybody, we can fit it by a parabol and observe that we have a range of scaling exponents that can be quite large. Anyway, this result suggests that the homogeneity hypothesis should be revisited, and instead of a global scale invariance like Kolmogorov uses, we should instead consider a local energy balance. So this is what we can do. We start from Navier-Stokes, and to do a local scale invariance, we can, for example, apply a kind of wavelet transform by convoluting the velocity field by a filter of width L, and we obtain the following energy balance, which just look like exactly like the Karman-Monin-Howard equation, except that you have an additional flux term here, which comes from the fact that we don't have homogeneity. So this gradient in front does not go to 0 because we don't take average over space. But similarly to Karman-Howarth, we have here a variation of local energy at the scale Ln at the point x at time t. This is quite local. This is at a position now. And like in Karman-Howarth, we have two additional terms. One, which is just d of L, which is the local energy transfer, which characterizes how energy is transferred from scale to another through the nonlinear term. And we have a local viscous dissipation term. So we have the expression of this local energy transfer. Since it is very important in Kolmogorov theory, it is then logical to try to look at what this term looks. And this is an example of what is this term at a scale which is very small, near the Kolmogorov scale, in numerical simulation. And you observe that this term is very intermittent. Exactly like the vorticity field here that is recalled on the right at the same time. And what you observe is that these local energy transfer are not exactly the same. You know, in the region where there are high energy transfer, you see a lot of vorticity, but they don't coincide place to place. Okay, this is interesting. And now that we have this local energy transfer, then the idea is to see whether the problem with Kolmogorov do not come from this high energy transfer. This would be logical because you see everything on Kolmogorov relies on this energy transfer. And it was actually a suggestion by Preshnan that these energy transfer are crucial in determining the intermittency. So let's do the following thing. We can now again compute the velocity structure function, and we can do two things. If we compute it on the whole flow, so on the whole flow here, including all these regions, then of course we compute the structure function, we measure the velocity exponent, and we find this red curve, this green curve that is not linear like the Kolmogorov theory would predict. Okay, this is just I told you already about this result. But now we can do something else. Let's do another thing, is that we compute the structure function everywhere, but at these areas where the energy transfer are very high. Then what is remarkable is that we still get some scaling laws. And if I measure the velocity, the exponent from these scaling laws, then I have the yellow curve, the yellow point, which you see fall exactly on the Kolmogorov line. So in other way, exactly like in the intuition of Batchelor and Townsend, this very active region where the local energy transfer are very high are really responsible for the intermittency, because if we remove them from the flow, then we lose the intermittency and we find again a perfectly self-similar law. We can do other things because we have this structure. We can, for example, compute the local energy budget in a strong localized event of high energy transfer. And for example, here we have a kind of a structure, high energy transfer around something that looks like a spiral. And here you have the local viscous dissipation. Here the local energy transfer, and you see this behavior, which is sort of puzzling. From dimensional argument, I will show you this in a moment, that di of L should go like L to the 3h minus 1. So if I measure this slope, then I have the feeling that h could be equal to 0.2. So indeed, this structure is characterized by another scaling exponent than Kolmogorov. But you see that these kind of things, they meet at a certain point. So what's going on here? Why do they meet? Well, it's just very simple physics, and I show you to it. Here I recall you the expression of the local energy transfer, and then there is a local energy dissipation. And by dimensional argument, if the velocity increment goes like L to the h, it is very easy to see that this local energy transfer scale like L to the 3h minus 1, while the viscous term scales like nu L to the 2h minus 2. So if you start, U of course is very small. So if you start at large scale, the viscous dissipation is very small, but it increases like 2h minus 2, which is very steep. And so at some point it catches the local energy transfer at a scale that is just given by the balance between the two terms. In this case, if you do the math, you find that this scale, I call it eta h, scales like the Reynolds minus 1 over 1 plus h, where h is the local scaling exponent. Of course, you recover the expression of the Kolmogorov scale for h equal 1/3. But what is going on at this scale? At this scale, eta h, what I told you is that the viscous energy, the local viscous dissipation is now strong enough to smooth out all the gradients and in fact to regularize the flow. So if you look in the scale space and you look at the velocity increments, it goes from L to the H, from large scale, up to this regularizing scale, eta h, at which scale it becomes regular, and then by Taylor expansion, you see that it just becomes proportional to L. So, at this scale, you can see that the local energy transfer should scale like L square, and this is indeed what we observe. And if H equal 1, then the local viscous dissipation is becoming constant, and this is indeed what we observe. Okay, so this local energy balance seems to apply in this structure with an H that depends on the structure. But what is very puzzling is the behavior of this regularizing scale, because you see that they depend on H. And if you see where the regularization occurs, you see that as soon as H is less than 1/3, as soon as the structure is characterized by H less than 1/3, and this was the case of the spiral structure I showed you, then the regularizing scale is less than the Kolmogorov scale. Okay, so what do we have here? We have a new picture of turbulence. You have, on the other hand, on the one hand, here is you have Kolmogorov scale. Okay, the scale at which Kolmogorov turbulence is regularized by viscosity. So on the left of this point, so for for scale larger than Kolmogorov scale, you have what I call the Kolmogorov world, in which if there are any local scaling exponents, they are all larger than 1/3, and in which you have the Kolmogorov spectrum. And beyond this scale, there is a new world which I call the dissipative world, which is a world in which the structure of H less than 1/3, and in which they are regularized only at a scale which is much smaller or much smaller than Kolmogorov scale. And I'm talking about this new world, dissipative world, because from most of you who work on turbulence, usually you don't care about this dissipative world, because we have all in our minds the Kolmogorov picture of turbulence. So we know that Kolmogorov turbulence is regularized like this. After this Kolmogorov scale, the spectrum falls very rapidly. So usually we just don't care about this dissipative world. But as a matter of fact, as I showed you, this dissipative world is very important in turbulence because it is responsible for intermittency. And so the question in the rest of the second half of my talk, what I will try to deal is how can we observe the structure in the dissipative world and how to model the structure in the dissipative world. And I want to stress that to observe the structure in the dissipative world, it necessarily means almost that we have to go to experiment, because you see, if you use numerical simulation first, many of the people would like to stop at Kolmogorov scale, because if not, the computational burden is too large. And even, you know, by numerical simulation, going into dissipative world is impossible, because you always have a cutoff scale. So the tool to observe the structure of the dissipative world should be adapted to experiment. And in fact, we already have the tool. I have described it to you. This is the local energy transfer that I recall here, because if you look at this term, what you notice is that it is based on velocity increments. So if you have the velocity measurement, you have them right away without performing any additional treatment to your data. And it is just this third power of the velocity increment convoluted by some function, which is a kind of filter. So even if you have noise in your data, this measurement will perform you, will give you an indicator that is with a much decreased noise with respect to original data. So it is a rather good indicator that we can trust, because we are sure that, contrary to indicator based on velocity derivative like vorticity, then you will not increase the noise in experiment. And why is it a good indicator? Well, I told you, this indicator goes like L to the 3h minus 1. So you see that as you go down the scale, any region with h is superior as 1/3 will provide you an indicator that will be decreasing with scale and eventually tending to 0. At the Kolmogorov scale, it will be equal to 0. And for region with h less than 1/3, so into the dissipative world, this quantity will, on the other hand, first increase until it reaches the region where it is regularized, but it will increase, and so becoming very big, and so very easy to capture with this indicator. So just to show you how it works, here is an example on a classical example, just on a shock for which h is equal to 0. So in this region here on the left and on the right of the shock, the velocity field is regular, so the indicator should be equal to 0. And here, the indicator should provide a non-zero value. And here you see the indicator as a function of scale. As I decrease the scale, on the left and on the right of the shock, it is equal to 0 indeed. And it shines up, it lights up and shines just at the location where there is a big velocity gradient. So it's a nice indicator. We applied it to our data. And you see, like in the case of the shock, we have some little arrows pointing towards special areas. And we know that in these areas, we have captured a structure with an H, which is probably smaller than 1/3, and so which is into the dissipative world. So that's very nice. With this, we have a way to treat all our data. We can perform probability distribution function of these local energy transfer, and they are very non-Gaussian, and they are characterized by very large tails. And of course, because of the structure of this local energy transfer, the higher the energy transfer, the higher the probability to catch a very small h we have. So the very singular structure, in some sense, a very intermittent structure. So what we did is with our data, we tried to find what were the most irregular events by looking at the extreme values of this local energy transfer. So we did that in a variety of papers, and more recently using a 3-dimensional velocity measurement. And what we found is that this kind of events really always occurred in the vicinity of vorticity tubes or sheets. So here are examples. For example, here it is an event, you see it is at the location where the 3 black lines intersect. This is just in the middle of what we call a screw vortex, in which the 3 lines go into spiral like this. We have also observed this kind of experiment, this kind of event in the vicinity of what we call roll vortices, because then the streamlines were like rolls separating from each other. And we also find at some rare occasion what we call U-turns, that is, the trajectories of particles was doing U-turns. And the point was at the vicinity or in between 2 sorts of vorticity sheets. So in fact, what we can do is that since we have many of these events, and since they are all sorts of similar structure, we can do an average over all these structures to get our average event. So to do this, we all reorientate them along the same axis, and we perform average. And this is what we obtain in the end. This is the kind of average typical result that we have, is that the highest energy transfer occur near this kind of structure, which is, you see, it's a filament. It's non-axis symmetric, but if you look at the vorticity profile, in the direction here, which is away from these two kind of ears, then we observe that it is very well described by Gaussian vorticity profile. That is, it's kind of a Berger's vortex. But it's not quite a Berger's vortex because it's not actually symmetric. And so to understand where do this kind of little structure appear, we had a look at time resolve measurement to see what was going on. So here, what you see is a picture of the small scale vorticity in our experiment. So you will see it evolve as a function of time. We can track them. In yellow and orange, you have ISO values of high vorticity. And in blue here, what you see is our local indicator. And it is colored in blue when it takes a rather large value. So here you see the picture, and you see that this indicator becomes high whenever there is some kind of interaction of vortices. And in fact, here we can take a closer look at another event. Here, this is from a point of view Eulerian plus Lagrangian. I have added in pink trajectories of particles as we have measured here. So you have Eulerian vorticity field, trajectories of particles, and in blue, you have the indicator that we have. And you see here, there is one vortex, a second one that is interacting, and you see the blue is all over the place in the vicinity of the two interacting vortices. So this means that there is a link between these areas of very high energy transfer as reconnection. And if we want to attribute a kind of a local exponent, h equal to 1, we can again try to look at how the distance between the two vortex varies with time. And this is an example of a measurement. In fact, this is a reconnection that you just saw before. And you see that delta of t, the distance between the two particles, go like square root of t before and after the reconnection. So this is very nice. We have an exponent. 1/2 means that we have h equal to -1. But h to -1 is something very special, because if you look at just what I said previously, if you look at the regularizing scale corresponding to this event, you see that if I put h equal -1 into this expression, then what I find is that the regularizing scale is 0. In other words, this exponent is precisely the exponent that can never be regularized. So in other way, since it is never regularized, it is a kind of singularity of the fluid. So it's very puzzle, but this is maybe not so surprising, because in fact there is a well-known model of reconnection which is based on Bayeux-Savart, and here there are some excellent papers about this that I mentioned here, and you can show using Bayeux-Savart approximation by which the vortex lines are just moving according to the velocity field that they produce. You can show that indeed during the reconnection, the distance between the two vortex indeed scales like decrease like square root of time, as we find. But you can also show that the maximum velocity in fact diverges like 1 over square root of time, which we don't observe here. And of course, this model is very nice because it is very simple. You can do very detailed computation. But it is not very satisfying because by this we capture a singularity. You can show that using Bayeux-Savart, you capture a singularity of nonlinear Schrödinger equation. And so I was myself not so satisfied. I say, well, can we try to find a model of small scale interaction that is closer to Navier-Stokes? So for this, well, this is where we come to the last part of my talk. You have to rescale that for h equal -1, the rescaling symmetry is this one, and it is an exact symmetry of Navier-Stokes. And if you look at what it means, for example, if you look at what it means for the velocity field, you realize that it means that if you rescale the time by gamma square and x by gamma, then the velocity field is rescaled by 1 over gamma. So it means that this kind of flow that obey this symmetry are homogeneous solution of Navier-Stokes of degree -1. So these homogeneous solutions of degree -1 are quite nice. A lot of interesting mathematical properties. Of course, when it comes to finding exact solution of Navier-Stokes, it was natural that Landau tried to use them to find exact solution of Navier-Stokes. If you don't make additional hypothesis, it's quite difficult to find just homogeneous solution of Navier-Stokes of degree -1. So Landau did two further assumptions. First, he assumed that the solution be stationary, and then he assumed axisymmetric. He looked for axisymmetric solution. And axisymmetric case is quite nice because, as I told you, the event we were recording were often found in the vicinity of axisymmetric vortices, or some structure looking like more or less axisymmetric. So we decided to study into further detail this solution. So what are they? This solution, they are stationary solution, axisymmetric stationary solution of Navier-Stokes with a force at the origin. So they are divergence free, and they obey this equation, which is Navier-Stokes solution, with a force just at the origin, which is proportional to nu square. And the general form of this solution is very nice. It is given by one axis or one spin, if you want. This is this vector gamma, which provides the orientation of the structure. So in the following, we impose that the norm of this vector of this spin be less than 1. And from this, you build a homogeneous function of degree 1 through this formula. And your velocity field is just given by the sum of the gradient of the log of this function plus 2x, the Laplacian of the log of this function. The force that is applied at the origin for this solution has this expression. You see that it varies from 0 to infinity when gamma is equal to 1. With some simple asymptotic law. And in fact, here you see the velocity field produced around the structure and the vorticity field observed around the structure. So this structure, in fact, is singular. It is singular and is decaying from the origin as 1 over r. And you see that it is done in such a way that so it has an orientation which is given by gamma, which is a little spin, and in which the velocity around here is pinch. So in French, pinch is pincé. So we decided to call them pincés. So these are some elementary particles. And what can we do with them? So of course, Navier-Stokes equations are non-linear, so a superposition of stationary solution is not a solution. But if you allow to have a set of pinceaux that have their position and spin depend on time, then this set of solution can be a solution of Navier-Stokes, provided they have some special interaction law. And the interaction law, you can find what is very nice is that the interaction is Hamiltonian, and it is provided by the following Hamiltonian, which is the scalar product of the velocity of all other pinceaux except that the one we consider, multiplied by some generalized momentum of the pinceau, which is in the direction of the spin with some special norm. And the equation of movement for each pinceau is just given by this Hamiltonian dynamics. Okay, this looks a little bit complicated, but in some case, for example, in the case where you have a dipole of pinceaux, so two pinceaux with same magnitude, with a spin with same magnitude but opposite direction, we can integrate their equation very easily, and we can have them interact according to the Hamiltonian dynamic. And so here is an example of interaction. So you see that the two pinceaux interact between each other. And what is very interesting is that there are two stages in the interaction. you see, they start at a certain distance. First, you see, they start to get close to each other. And you see that at this time, you see the vorticity sort of reconnect because there is a sort of bridge in between the two. And then after a certain time, then they separate from each other and much more rapidly than the way they were approaching. If you look carefully at how is interaction, you can have a look at the distance between the two pinsons as a function of time. And for example, if I plot R2 as a function of time, you see that roughly we have the approach like a square root, and then they separate like a square root and faster than when they reconnect. So this is like the kind of law we were seeing by interaction of vortices, like Yarrow and Husserl. And for example, if you look at the maximum of vorticity around the pinson when they reconnect, you see that the vorticity first decreases before the time of closer approach, and then it increases and then decay. And this is exactly the type of behavior that you observe for reconnection of real vortices in simulation by Yarrow and Husserl. So in fact, we did a lot. We try interacting a lot of pinsons, and what we observe is that most of the time, so they start approach and then separate. So you see that they decay, their distance increases a lot. So the interaction between pinsons, dipole of pinsons is repulsive. In fact, we studied more using all this simulation more closely the collapse and escape stage, and we found two exponents. It's not really a square root, as I told you. In fact, in the collapse stage, you have an exponent 0.65, so it would mean an effective exponent h equal -half. And during the escape stage, the escape is characterized by an exponent 0.8, so it's a kind of exponent -1/4. So we have intermittency in this person, exactly like we have for the small scale structure. And then we can also consider interaction between a pinson and a regular field, because as I showed you, these events of very large energy transfer are embedded in some sort of more regular fluid. And we can show that when you do that, what is going on is that the system of the regular field and pinson is solution of Navier-Stokes equation, provided these two equations are satisfied. So for the fluid, it just obeys the classical filtered Navier-Stokes equation with the Reynolds stress, and with an additional stress that corresponds to the force applied to the field by the pinson, while the pinson, it just obeys a simple dynamic by which it is advected by the regular at the velocity of the regular field at its position, and its spin, it's sheared by the velocity field at its position. So what is also interesting is that the two contributions between the Reynolds stress and the force applied by the pinson onto the regular field, they are equal at the Kolmogorov scale, and this force start to dominate with respect to the Reynolds stress when we go into the dissipative world. So we see we have this kind of two-fluid model of turbulence. On the left of Kolmogorov scale, we have a system which is described by coarse-grained Navier-Stokes equation, and it is called a coarse-grained regular velocity, and it describes, in fact, the Kolmogorov world. On the right of Kolmogorov scale, we have a world described by entities that we call pinsons, which describes the dissipative world. They have a Hamiltonian dynamic, and the two worlds are coupled from the pinson to the coarse-grained equation by the Reynolds stress, and from the coarse-grained equation to the pinson through advection and distortion by the coarse-grained velocity field. So I'm almost finished. I just want to mention what is the interest of the two-fluid model, why we have introduced and why we think it's interesting to consider it any further. If you want to do a numerical simulation, for example, on our experiment, in the traditional Kolmogorov picture, you say, well, the smaller scale I have to capture is Kolmogorov scale. So this gives you a number of grid points which is proportional to Reynolds to the 9/4, and which correspond in our case to 10 to the 7, which is possible by DNS. This is actually the simulation that you perform. But now, if you want to capture all these dissipative, all these entities lying in the dissipative world, and for example, imagine that you want to be able to capture this entity, which corresponds to h equal minus 0.2, which might be appearing in our experiment if we believe the multifractal spectrum we observe. Then it means that you have to go down to the eta to the minus 1/5. And so you have to now consider 10 to the 21 degrees of freedom, number of grid points. So this is impossible by DNS. But now, if you consider our two-field model, it's much better because you say, okay, from the large scale until Kolmogorov scale, I consider just this simulation, it's okay. But if now I want to capture physics involved by the dissipative world, which introduce very localized energy transfer and fluctuation, then I discretize it into a set of pinceaux that will interact by Hamiltonian interaction. And then I can still keep the number of degrees of freedom to 10 to the 7, and which is possible by DNS. It just implies that you have to solve simultaneously the Navier-Stokes equation plus the n pinceau coupled Hamiltonian equation. So this is the end of my talk. I have taken you onto a rather long journey from Batchelor to the pinceau world. So I have shown you that we have defined a scalar indicator to explore the nature of small scales in experimental and numerical simulation down to the Kolmogorov scale. There are coherent structures living below the Kolmogorov scale that could be associated with reconnection events and be footprints of dissipative singularities of Euler equation or singularities of Navier-Stokes. I have shown you that the structure in the dissipative world are connected with intermittency. And finally, using all their properties, we have devised a two-field model coupling a regular field obeying K41, more or less dynamics, and a small-scale Navier-Stokes equation made of pinceaux that interacts through Hamiltonian. So all these results confirm the remarkable visionary observation and interpretation of Batchelor and Townsend. And as a perspective, we are currently performing, when COVID will leave us performing experiment, we are currently performing experiment on a larger experiment to be able to explore the sub-Kolmogorov world better and maybe to improve this description. So with this, I finished and I thank you and I'm ready for your question.
Can the value of the exponent h be negative? And if so, what do those solutions tell us about vortices?
So yes, they can be negative formally. Let me share my screen again.
You probably showed us some of those actually, yeah.
Yes, I showed them. In fact, formally, yes, they can be negative, but only for some range of scale, as I told you. As I told you, in the multifractal model of Parisi-Frisch of this kind of event, the probability to observe this event is given by the function C of h. And here is what are the measurements we have in our experiment. And so you see that we have a point here which is very close to 0, which corresponds already to a codimension close to 1.5. And if we extrapolate, we don't have actual measurement here. It would mean a lot of data that we don't have for the moment. There is possibility to see h being negative, but as I told you, it's just it's not a real negative exponent. It's in this interpretation for some range of scale. After a certain moment, they become regularized, and the velocity field is just normal, and this scaling exponent goes to h.
What is the helicity of these small scale structures, I presume?
Yes, this is Keith Moffat. The helicity is 0. It's quite interesting. It's a 0 helicity structure.
that's some people who know about helicity will no doubt have more questions about that in course. How small are the smallest structures you found compared to the Kolmogorov scale, and what is their circulation? How rare are they?
Okay, this is a good question. The problem is that up to now in our experiment, we just reached the Kolmogorov scale. The Kolmogorov scale is equal to the resolution of our experiment. So we found structure of the order of the Kolmogorov scale, but still I showed you a local energy transfer in which indicating that the local exponent could be 0.2, below Kolmogorov. That is why we would like to perform a measurement at a smaller scale to go beyond Kolmogorov scale and do all these sorts of analysis. So I cannot answer to you now. We hope that the pandemic will stop and that we can perform this experiment that we've been waiting for 2 years now.
Is there a relation between Pinson and Novikov vortons?
A very good question. Yes, this model, in fact, was inspired also by us by the Novikov vorton. It is exactly the same spirit, but Novikov vorton is, if you know the model, they are actually singularities of Euler equation. So by essence, in spirit, the Pinsons are just the equivalent of vorton, except that vorton, they are singularities of Euler, while our Pinsons are singularities of Navier-Stokes.
And what are your views in general on the use of renormalization groups in the problem of turbulence? That's a very general question for you. To finish with, that's the last one.
Oh, to finish. Well, I think renormalization group is really a great tool, and in fact we have made a lot of progress. I mean, not me, but some people like Léonie Canet using non-perturbative renormalization group. The problem is that it's a very heavy tool, and right now the only result that you find is kind of, you find the Kolmogorov spectrum, maybe you can compute Kolmogorov things, but it's kind of difficult. And what I want to emphasize is that if there are structures like this lurking in the dissipative range, then maybe renormalization group cannot really capture them, because it should try to renormalize locally, not globally, the scaling. So that's all I can say, but I'm not an expert.
In Navier-Stokes turbulence, the velocity field has structures of filaments and vortices, which here is proposed to have an elementary structure of the Pinson. For scalar turbulence with linear temperature gradient, the structures can be sheets. Have you thought about another elementary structure like an extension of the Pinson concept? E.g., for example, the elementary structure could be of lamellae or something.
This is a very good comment. I mean, we just finished the paper. If any of you are interested, it should be on arXiv now. So I think there are many developments on these Pinsons, and all of you are that can contribute to improve it and make it a better model of the dissipative world. But we didn't have time to think.
Not yet.